قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله وكفى، وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى، أما بعد. We continue with our discussion, and today we're going to explore the issue of freedom of expression. But as I continue and as we commence, imagine if I started this discussion by calling you names. What if I used the most vile language to curse you or the person you love most? Would you continue listening? Even if you did, would you take seriously what I had to say? Would you have an open mind to try and understand what was said? Of course you wouldn't. You would probably switch your set off. No human being should be expected to tolerate uncivilized, degrading language, deliberate abuse, and repugnant expressions. No human is expected to accept that. As humans, we qualify ourselves through the use of our language, our mannerism, and our sensibilities. We are careful about how others perceive us. What we say is how we present ourselves to the world. Our leader Nelson Mandela once said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. And if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. No one prides himself on the language of insults. Insults never appeal to anyone's mind, nor does it appeal to your heart. In reality, insulting behavior and speech is a throwback to the worst part of our childhood. Let's imagine and let's take our memories back. In the playground, we would see bullies using abusive language. And remember, I'm going to come back to this. And we might have spoken about this. Freedom of expression by the powerful. So in the playground, we would see bullies using abusive language to belittle others weaker than them. Good parents, good teachers, and communities expend great efforts to include or to inculcate in children kindness, listening skills, empathy, and teaching them not to be abusive or offensive. How then, and according to what logic, does it become a right to offend? Does it become a right to offend? And how can such behavior be deemed in any way appropriate, let alone civilized? We only need to look back to the 1930s when the free language of bigotry was used against a minority group to demonize them, which led to the horrific events of the Holocaust. As shocking as this may sound, it highlights a very important point. Whether we like it or not, what we say can make or break our world. Despite this, there are those who claim that we can say whatever we want, and we can say it in whichever way we want. Every free-thinking person will say that they believe in the freedom of speech. If we didn't, we wouldn't be free to discuss politics, religion, the evil of bigotry, racism, and much more. Our freedom to speak about these things is what makes us human. Our freedom to speak about issues is what makes us as human. Let's not use that humanity to dehumanize others. Let's not use that humanity to dehumanize others. What I would like to do is let's look at the history of freedom of expression, the history of freedom of speech. How did it start? When we examine the historical circumstances of freedom of speech, we will see that it emerged as a result of a specific problem. Christian Europe was under the control of the church and the divinely chosen kings, and was subjugated to centuries of authoritarian rule that was absent of transparency, which was absent of accountability. This is why people demanded the freedom to take the oppressive state to account, to establish justice, to learn about the truth of the world. Hence, we find freedom of speech was a concept that was born out of the European Enlightenment in order to account those in power, in order to establish justice in society, and as a means for seeking the truth and a means for the facilitating of human progression. The inception of the modern concept of freedom of speech as we know it today arose under this particular context. However, this notion of freedom was never, and I repeat, was never intended to insult. It was never intended to offend or defame any social group. This is why the 19th century British philosopher and one of the founders of the free speech movement, John S. Mill, argued that for truth and justice, we must be cautious with our language. If freedom of expression was introduced in society to establish justice, to take those in power to account for their oppression, then surely the freedom to express this and to take them to account, one needs to have justice in the way we speak. And we must be cautious with our language, lest we, in our zealousness of expressing the oppression of others, should not cross the line. And therefore we say, is it freedom to insult? Is it freedom to degrade? In light of what we have just said, you probably be thinking that something has seriously gone wrong. Something has most certainly gone wrong in society. Something has certainly gone wrong in us as humans. And maybe, probably, you are thinking that if that was the history of how freedom of expression was introduced, what has really gone wrong? And yes, you are right. We are now far removed from the civilized discourse of the likes of John Mill, Aristotle, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, Nelson Mandela, William Shakespeare. Think about it. There are many news outlets, there are many publications, websites, and other media that have actually contradicted the fundamental objectives of freedom of speech by conflating it and confusing it with the right to degrade, with the right to insult, with the right to defame. We have all seen and experienced the lies, the hate, and the defamation of many in the media. Sadly, it has led to more lies. It has led to more hate. It has led to more mistrust. This manifestation of free speech cannot and will never facilitate a harmonious society where intellectual and rational dialogue between different communities can take place. The unfortunate reality today is that freedom of speech is politicized. It is politicized in practice, absent of the most basic human civility to respect others and to respect the ideas and the beliefs and the values of others. Do we want to live in such a society? Stay tuned. When we get back, we will try to answer this question. Do we really want to live in such a society?
طوق نجاتي قرآني نبض حياتي قرآني طهر ذاتي قرآني عصمة أمري قرآني طوق نجاتي.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We continue with our discussion, and before the break we asked a question. Do we want to live in a society that is filled with hatred? And in the effort and the energies that are required for freedom of expression, we cross the line to freedom to insult. Do we really want to live in such a society? A society that is free to curse rather than converse. The postmodern philosopher Soren Kierkegaard aptly said, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use." To illustrate this point, here are some reasons why being free to degrade and insult actually goes against the objectives of free speech. Firstly, from the perspective of truth and progress. In order to acquire the truth and facilitate progress, reasoned and well-mannered argumentation and a discussion is required. And this must be couched in human language. It must be couched, and again I say, in human language, because it is humane to use respectful language. Insulting, degrading, insulting and degrading language does not facilitate truth. It does not facilitate progress. Imagine the prominent physicist Stephen Hawking explaining one of his famous theories. This was mentioned by someone, that imagine he explaining one of his famous theories. What would happen if he then used pornographic imagery to denounce those who oppose it, or continually swore at them during his presentation? Or take any other concept where a person presents it, and he presents it with pornography, or he presents it by swearing at the people whom he's presenting it to. Would that expressionism facilitate honest, respectful discussion? It is more likely to create a barrier to knowledge. It is more likely to create a barrier of understanding. Secondly, from the aspect of accountability, from the aspect of justice, from the aspect of taking governments to account, and individuals also require good, polite, reasoned dialogue. If one was to approach a dictator, cursing them and using the most vile language, would one successfully bring them to account? It's very unlikely. In order to do so, it would be better to articulate a positive case against their crimes and against their injustices. These examples show that insult and degradation defeat the very objective of the freedom of speech. It defeats the very objective of the claims against, and in this case, Islam, where people say Islam is not an open language. It is not a tolerant language. There is, however, a fine line between deliberate and unintended insults. After all, one person's insults can be another's form of dialogue. So it is not as simple as saying don't insult. It is not as simple as saying don't degrade each other, rather than just allowing ourselves to be free to hate, to be free to curse, to be free to degrade, thereby not achieving the objectives of free speech. The onus is for us to try and understand each other's sensitivities so that we can better communicate, so that we can better convince, so that we can better educate, and so that we can better express ourselves in the spirit of mutual understanding. We've heard it before. With freedom comes great responsibility. We have a responsibility to engage with each other in ways that are best. The negative consequences of insulting and degrading, with freedom comes responsibility. We cannot simply say whatever we like. Imagine screaming, bomb, bomb, in the middle of a crowded bus. Such expressions would lead to chaos, to harm, to disorder. So we need to take responsibility of our freedom. The British philosopher John Mill argued that speech should be restricted if it leads to harm. Speech should be restricted if it leads to harm. This is what the British philosopher John Mill had said. And Mill used the 19th century corn dealers as an example. And he argued that a mob should incur punishment if they express that corn dealers are starvers of the poor when assembled before the house of a corn dealer. Now, if he had went to that extent, clearly, some speech not only facilitates harm, but causes unthinkable calamities. There is a broad consensus, and I want us to listen to this very carefully, because I'm using this, and I'm using this example deliberately with full responsibility. There is a broad consensus that the Nazi cartoons and imagery depicting the Jewish community as evil greedy and selfish, led to the social engineering of perceiving that they were less than human and deserved to be punished and killed. And focus on what I've just said. The function of anti-Semitic imagery, in Hitler's Mein Kampf gradually initiated the wider parts of the German population to what? To racism, to dehumanization of the Jewish community. This consequently led to the erroneous belief, and I repeat, this led to the erroneous belief that all Jewish people were an illness and the cure was their extermination. That was the result of that type of free speech. That was the result of that type of freedom of expression. This free speech was the blueprint for genocide. The 20th century philosopher George Santayana famously wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But despite all the Holocaust memorials and remembrance, have we truly learned from our past? A similar discourse is being touted in some of the more sensationalist media outlets of today, with there being a striking similarity between the anti-Semitic satire from the Nazi era and that aimed at Muslims today. Many argue that this has facilitated a growing hatred against Muslims. In fact, in an article analyzing survey results that focused on Muslims and Islam post-2001, Charles Kuzman, the professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, concluded the data, and he indicated American attitudes towards Muslim Americans have grown more negative. A growing segment of the population is willing to express negative views about Muslim Americans in recent years. This growing negativity towards Islam and Muslims is not only an American problem, not only a European problem, it is becoming a major problem. In its 2004 annual report, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance found Islamophobia continues to manifest itself in different guises. Muslim communities are targets of negative attitudes, sometimes violence and harassment. They suffer multiple forms of discrimination, including sometimes from certain public institutions. And this institution, the ECRI, is worried about the current climate of hostility against persons who are or are believed to be Muslims. In conclusion, the current freedom to express, and unfortunately, recent survey polls and publications are indicating a stark rise in hate crimes against Muslims. So isn't it time we stopped the hate and started to debate in a language conducive to positive, compassionate engagement? Fear, anxiety, and hate will continue to exist unless communities make the effort to understand each other, not only by sharing our commonalities, but by discussing and understanding our differences. Will the fears and anxieties vanish? We need to stop the hate and start to debate in a language conducive to positive, respectful, compassionate engagement. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري.